I'm joined now by Janet Henry, who is Senior Economist at HSBC. Let's start, Janet, by looking at inflation, because it does seem to be that in this kind of good news story of the emerging markets pushing forward growth, inflation is now a spectre that most of them are going to have to deal with.
Yes, that's right. As you say, in the index, it did show a re-acceleration into the end of 2010. Not back to where we were in the first half of the year, but certainly a re-acceleration. But the big news is that the pricing components, particularly input prices, are now back close to their peaks that we haven't seen since the second quarter of 2008, when, of course, there was the big food and energy-driven commodity price scare that started to come through. And you're absolutely right, it's fairly broadly based. We've seen this globally in the PMIs in the developed and the emerging world, but the big concern in the emerging world, whether it's China, India, Latin America, and even in Central and Eastern Europe, is that a lot of these economies are a little bit closer to potential. So there's a bit more scope that it does feed through into more broadly based price increases coming through.
And when we look at a country like China, obviously big concerns there about the inflation and about particular bubbles. What's the feeling about how that's going to be dealt with this year, and in particularly how that's going to play on manufacturing, which is important for China?
Right. As far as China is concerned, yes, pricing pressures have risen. But in a historical context, inflation is really not that high yet. And China still has a whole range of options that it can pursue. Of course, it can raise interest rates, it can allow currency appreciation, which it's reluctant to allow too much of, and it can also tighten fiscal policy. So I think all of those policies will be pursued. We expect further rate increases. We expect another 200 basis point rise on reserve requirements in the first half of this year. And actually, we do expect inflation to peak out by the middle of 2010, because some of the tightening measures are already underway, particularly the quantity tightening as far as money is concerned.
And what does the index tell us about India? India's roaring ahead, isn't it?
Yeah, certainly in terms of the acceleration, it seemed to be coming through a bit more strongly in China, but in absolute terms, the growth numbers do continue to look a little bit better in India, and of course the pricing numbers as well. I think in terms of, are they behind the curve, it looks a little bit more like India and perhaps other parts in Asia are in more danger of slipping behind the curve than in fact China, where a lot of these measures are already underway.
And in terms of Russia, how does Russia fare in all of this?
Russia and other parts of Central and Eastern Europe have shown a much clearer re-acceleration. And for me, as a European economist, I think this is quite encouraging. We tend to focus very much, as far as emerging markets are concerned, on China and India and Asia. Recently, it's become quite clear that actually it was Africa that had some of the strongest growth rates over the last year. Yes. And for me, in this latest index, it was the employment numbers in Central and Eastern Europe that were particularly impressive, and a lot of that is actually coming through from the strength of Germany. So you've got a mixed picture across the emerging world, but Russia and the rest of the emerging world, the recent numbers have certainly been encouraging.
You mentioned Africa briefly there, and that may turn out to be one of the success stories longer term. Is that the feeling there, and is that the information that we're getting from the index?
Longer term, unfortunately, we don't actually cover most of Africa other than South Africa in the index, but certainly the numbers have been more impressive. And in terms of the whole global commodity price story, the structural influences on food prices, then certainly the demographically strong countries in Africa and the Middle East will be a long-term structural influences on those factors.
OK. Janet Henry, thank you very much indeed for joining us today.